Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, please? This place is peaceful.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
Yeah, so I'm back. I just took excuse here. People are not yet here.
Hello, everyone. Please
Um,
give us a minute.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but I think I'm not
Did I not? This is his. It's not very sweet. Because I think I should learn to call him. Okay. For some reason, anytime I use my phone,
Okay.
in the weekends, I should just somebody comes to see, I do correct. It's very upside down.
Is one. Well, there's a way you do it now.
What do you mean the upside down thing?
There's a way you
Like,
do
is
it.
it flipping? Yeah. There's a way to do it. Let me see.
There's a way
To stop it from rotating. Yes, here.
Wait, let me see. Oh, wait, you already put it in.
No, I meant like the video here, like, see.
Oh, I know what do you want to do.
By the time we put it here, it comes down here. Not the portrait.
Wait, I don't get, sorry, just because I'm not getting this.
Really? But it goes this way. Okay, so put this down.
Oh, see, sometimes.
Put it in the
Okay. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's just. That's 100%.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so
Good evening.
hello, Chair. I think we're ready to start my local art. I don't see. So we're ready to start, Madam Chair. Ready to start.
Why did you?
No, they're sure.
Okay.
Good day, everyone. Good morning over there. Please, can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much. My name is Mosumola Adeojo. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Florida, and I'm the chair of this panel. The title of this panel is Emerging Frontiers in African Literature. And we have 4 presenters. Our first presenter, and each presenter will have 20 minutes for their presentation. So our first presenter is Kayode Odumboni, and the title of his presentation is Africa in the World, Analyzing Transatlantic Migration in Shaujia Patel's Migritude and Mira Nair's Mississippi Masala. So Kayode, if you're there, you may please start your presentation. Okay. Our first presenter is not there, so I think we'll just go with our second presenter. Dr. Ademola, are you ready? Dr. Ademola Adeshola.
Oh yeah. Can
All
everyone
right.
hear me?
Yes, we can. So I'm
Okay.
just going to read your bio, and then you may begin. So Dr. Ademola Adeshola is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Languages and Cultures, Mount Royal University, Calgary, Canada. His research and teaching interests are post-colonial studies, African/Black diaspora literatures, child soldier narratives, war and literature. Popular Dr. Ademola has published essays and book chapters on African literature and socio-political issues. His paper today is titled Reading Humor in Select African Child Soldier Novels. Hello, Dr. Ademola, did you hear me reading your bio?
Yes, I heard you.
Hello?
Yes, I heard you. Thank you. I
All
sent
right.
you a message. Can you please enable my screen sharing power?
Okay. I think LSA will do that.
Okay. All right. While they are doing that, I should just proceed with my paper because of time.
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone on the call here and in the room out there. Ademola Adeshola is my name, as you have heard. It's my pleasure to join you here today to present this paper, which, again, in its own way, it's a work in progress, as it were. Okay, now I can share my screen, they say. All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen now? Okay, I presume that is the case. So, as I said, okay. All right. So my paper today is reading humor in select African child soldier novels. I should quickly note that the inspiration for this paper came from a study of child soldier narratives that I recently conducted, and it's, of course, something I'm looking forward to be published in a book. But it was while I was conducting that research, in fact, after I had completed, what my interest was in that research, that I began to also think about something that occurred to me in that process, and that is the fact that when I looked at the critical works that have been done in response to those, African child soldier narratives, both fiction and non-fiction ones, it did occur to me that not, serious attention has been paid to the humor component, of the narrativizations that we find in those texts. And I decided I was going to be looking into that. And the first, attempt at doing that is what I am, considering in this paper, today. So at the heart of the works that I am, interpreting today, or if you like, these are the cover pages of the three novels that, constitute my interpretive engagement in this text. So quickly, I give you a summary of what my interest and argument, is in this paper. As I said, I'm reading humor in three select African child soldier narratives. And as you can see on the screen, those are the novels that I am, dealing with. Amadou Koroma's Allies Not Obliged, Uzodimma Iweala's Beast of No Nation, and Emmanuel Dongala's Johnny Mad Dog. One thing amongst others that feature, very clearly in this text are, the idea of humor, as a technique or device in this work. And so I argue that Koroma's, Iweala's, and Dongala's respective novels underscored the significance of humor as a mode of representing the tragedy of war involving children as soldiers and the societal dysfunction that poor leadership engenders. While the subject of war, militarization of children, and bad governance are far from being banner subjects, these writers' individual humorous portrayals of them suggest that a more effective way of depicting the human condition in post-colonial Africa is through a comedic style that foregrounds the grotesque, the laughable, the absurd, and of course the irrational. So by focusing on the individual, impossibly clownish child participant narrators of these selected novels, I aim to show how the use of humor as a mode of representation proves more significant in representing the misery of war and the pains of misgovernment in some recreated African states that we encounter in this world. Through my, engagement with this text, I argue that they demonstrate what actually Mbembe, maintained in an article that he calls "The Thin and It Doubles," that the mode of representation, according to him, for representing, quote, the immediate present, end of quote, of most African polities, distinguished by, again, what he called the crisis, quote, is true caricature with its excesses and its principles of proliferation, end of quote. And so at the center of my paper, a critical question that dominates is this: does the narrativization of war through through children's lenses trivialize or strengthen the seriousness of the subject? I hope to look at this, in what I am hoping to come up with at the end of the day in this project. And so in underlining humor as a funny way of being serious in my engagement with these select African child soldier novels, I actually intend to fill an important gap in the criticisms of the African child soldier genre. And so I also want to be able to make certain points regarding the context of these novels that we find. So the three novels that I am looking at, are written by Africans. Of course, Emmanuel Dungalas from Congo, Brazzaville, Amadou Koroma from, of course, Ivory Coast, Allies Not Obliged. And of course, a little difference there that we have is Beast of No Nation by Uzodimma Iweala, who identifies as Nigerian American. And so all of the works have their setting, in Africa, somewhere in Africa. And the other thing to note about the settings in this work is that while in Amadou Koroma's Allies Not Obliged, we have specific, clearly recognizable setting, which is Liberia and Sierra Leone, because the word of the text is set in these fictional spaces. In Emmanuel Dongala's Johnny Mad Dog and Beast of No Nation, what we find there, are unnamed settings. In other words, a homogeneous Africa, and you don't have a specific place there. I mean, I don't want to go into the significance of that for the kind of, focus that is, or rather, the kind of interest that these two novels portray, especially to Western audience. I'll leave that. But anyone who is familiar with Nigeria, especially the Nigeria of between 1967 and 1970, when the Civil War, the Nigerian-Biafran Civil War happened, would not fail to be able to establish that the recreated world in Beast of No Nation, of course, is partly the Biafran enclave and partly the Nigerian space. Similarly, if you look at Dongala's Johnny Mad Dog, you'll find out that if you do know a bit of Congo Brazzaville, again, which is a space where the phenomenon of child soldier, is quite prominent, or was prominent. we will not have any doubt regarding the fact that, again, what is recreated here is that particular space. And the other thing that is common to these three texts is, again, the kind of Africa, whether specific in Sierra Leone or Congo, Sierra Leone or Liberia, or even the unnamed one. One thing that is, that is common in this is also the question of the nature of Africa that is depicted. And so in this text, we find an Africa, again, I make that point, a homogeneous Africa that is convulsed by violence, one that is given, of course, to misgovernance. And to quote the novel of Yambo Olugwen, that Africa is forever bound to violence. Nothing seems to work there. Nothing, is functioning there. It's not a livable space. And even if there are issues that require people, to rise up and protect and do that, that is often undertaken in a negative sense. So nothing seems to work in the Africa that we find or that is discoverable in each of this world. Life is meaningless there, and what people do successfully elsewhere is in fact impossible in this kind of space. And war does only one thing, which is, of course, for pillaging, for killing and for maiming, for raping, and all kinds of atrocious undertakings, there. Again, I don't want to bore you with, because as I've read it in the previous, work that I have done on this, we find out that there is a way in which this depiction of Africa, in the sense that we find in this work, ties with the way in which Africa has been understood in Western imaginary, for a long time. And this works, does the work of promoting that negative view. But that's not what I'm interested in today. Another thing that is also important to this text, which I think is important to highlight, is that each of the texts, has a child participant that is telling, a child participant narrator, rather, that tells the story here. And it's important to note that all of these three narrators put together, when you look at them, biologically, they are children. In other words, if you go by answering the question of what is a child, and if you choose, as it is often done, again, to use that lazy term that we have been using, the West, you find out that chronological age, is often centered as a marker, of childhood. So that if you are between 0 and 18 or thereabout, then you're a child in a Western sense, as it were. However, a careful reading of all of these characters show that we're not dealing essentially with children in the sense in which, they are to be understood biologically by chronological age. If we pay attention to their agency by their actions, the things they do in the various ways in which they do them, it will become manifest that we are no longer dealing with children here. We're dealing with individuals who have crossed the border from childhood, to adulthood by their undertaking, precisely. So that's something that, we find there. So that, in other words, why the use of child participant narrators in these stories that deal with what ails most of the countries on the continent is notable in African literature. Their use in the African Child Soldier John allows for a fresh perspective that privileges humor as a funny way of engaging the serious for the purpose of making sense of them. So what we find in these three texts, even though these are works dealing with tragic development, war is about something that this story is about. So that when you look at Beast of No Nation, this is the story of Agu, the child participant narrator, who testifies to his witnessing, his actions, his undertakings within an armed group, as a child soldier. And when you come, of course, to Allah is Not Obliged, it's similar. This is also a testimony of a child, again, who witnesses to war and recount his own participation in that. The same thing is applicable in Emmanuel Dongala's Johnny Mad Dog. The principal character here, Johnny Mad Dog, also, testifies to his atrocious undertakings, within a group. And all of these characters tell these stories humorously. And that's the question here, that why is the story of atrocity, especially recounted through or focalized through a child's view, is told in a humorous way. I am making the argument that the use of humor as a means of telling this story helps us to understand humor as a way of being, or a manner of being serious, so that even when this, individuals are humorously telling the story of war, we want to understand that that humorous way of telling helps us to appreciate the seriousness, of what they have witnessed and what they are testifying to. I mean, it's paradoxical, but, that's the way it is here, and such that the way to understand the horror of what is at issue is to do so through the lens of, humor. And so when you pick this text, you begin to find out that our first introduction to the fact that humor suffuses each of them is how the main characters introduce themselves individually. And so very quickly, I want to go into that's, what I'm calling self-introduction. It is through this introduction that we begin to get inaugurated into the idea of the humor, that is to take place, or rather that supervenes largely in each of these texts. Chair, please feel free to let me know how I'm doing with time. I don't have to complete everything. I'm happy not to. But then let me quickly go into that. And so, as I said, the first impression that each of these three novels center humor in their depictions of the horrific human condition appears in the self-introduction of their participant narrators. And so I go to the first character here, who is Johnny, Mad Dog. It's important to highlight here, for those of us who haven't read the novel, that when we encounter the participant narrator of this story titled Johnny Mad Dog, Dongala's Johnny Mad Dog, we do not encounter him first as Johnny Mad Dog. He plays and uses different war names, sobriquet, and in those war names, even as he introduces himself by them, we see very rich humor that point our attention to something more important, something more troubling, something more serious about him and about the space in which he inhabits. And so, rather than introduce himself simply as Johnny, the child narrator of Dongala's story introduces himself humorously through different constructed word names. So here is him. I quote him here. He says, "A name isn't just a name. A name contains hidden power. It is no accident that I have taken the name Lufualiwa, which means kill death, or rather cheat death." Now, if you look at this, you begin to get a very important idea, of the character we're going to be encountering here. This is a highly, highly clownish, humorous, and funny individual. But then, who at the same time is given, to very serious, horrible and reprehensible conduct. And so when we encounter him first as Lufualiwa, which means kill dead, or rather cheat dead. And this is a person who, by the name he takes for himself, will see him engage in very dangerous actions, actions that are meant to show himself as invincible, but we do know that this is, of course, a pointless and meaningless undertaking, because as he himself will say later, he realizes that this name, does not by any means serve his purpose. This is not what he wants to do. He doesn't want to cheat death, but rather he wants to inflict death. He wants to kill people, in this way. And so he goes on to introduce himself by saying that he becomes dissatisfied with the name Lufualiwa, cheat death, as it says. And so he goes on by saying, I quote him again, "A name is never innocent. this is him coming to that realization that, look, I have picked the wrong name, which does not speak to the horrible thing that I want to see. I mean, he then goes on, Lufualiwa doesn't inspire fear. Someone who cheats death is certainly crafty, sly, cunning, and shrewd, but he has never struck fear into the enemy's ranks. From now on, I would call myself Matitimabi, poison weed, poison like diamba, the powerful hemp that grows around here and that makes your head spin, drives you crazy, poison like the deadly mushroom. End of quote. So this is Johnny. This is the second name he's taking. This is how he's introducing himself. And you can see, what comes with this name. How, he is so passionate about what he thinks this name represents, and that this name aligns with the kind of person and the kind of undertaking, that we associate him with. And so he goes further to explicate, this name. He explains it further, fulsomely by saying, quote, Matitimabi, evil, poisonous, deadly weed, the mushroom that kills, that sends you to the land of your ancestor, the cannabis, whose smoke makes your head explode into 1,000 psychedelic pieces. The beautiful, mysterious, yes, carnivorous flower that feeds on live animals. End of quote. Now, again, this, of course, explication is self-explanatory. And then you can understand the nature of the fellow we're dealing with and the humor. But underlining this humorous depiction or portrayal or profiling of himself is this important point to note. Do not forget that we're dealing with a child soldier here. And if you look at the concept itself, child, innocence, and then soldier, violence, you see that these are two, kind of like oxymoronic kind of construction. There's a conflict between the two. And even in the way that he characterizes or profiles himself here, that becomes manifest. For example, when he says that the name Matitimabi, meaning that weed that is at once beautiful. You can think of a child in that sense. And then on the other hand, it's mysterious, it's carnivorous, it's something that, of course, feeds on another. Then you can also see, hinting there at violence. And so this is a kind of individual that we are dealing with, so that in giving himself this name, in this humorous sense that he does, we understand Johnny Mad Dog as a child soldier who combines two, of course, nature together. He is friendly, he is beautiful, he is a child, he is innocent. And on the other hand, he is violent. So there's this duality to his character. And we are understanding that to think of him solely as a child and not pay attention to his other profile is to ignore an important side of his makeup. And of course, this funny way of introducing himself helps us, to come to that realization. Again, humorous as it is, this exposition on his war nickname does not show that, although biologically he is somewhat a child, Johnny is at once a dangerous person inhabiting a jungle-like space where strange and barbaric, things, of course, happen. And if you look at the, the armed group that he works with, you find out that there is nothing, of course, but violence and killing that they are given to. Before I transit to, others, it's also important to know how he comes to give himself the name, Johnny Mad Dog, which is the title of, the book, the novel himself. And so we encounter Johnny at some point again, jettisoning or abandoning the war name Matitimabi, and he makes a, he justifies why that name does no longer suit him. Haven't gone further, than from where we first met him as somebody who is just imagined as a killer. By the time he comes around to discard the name Matitimabi, he has transformed very significantly into something else. And so here he says to us, Matitimabi, a plant, even a poisonous one, won't scare the shit out of an enemy. With a pair of good boots, you can safely walk on it, trample it. No, It was a stupid name. I had to change it. End of quote. Now, he speaks glowingly of this terrible war name in this manner before he discards it. And wham, okay, as he says, oh, what I'm trying to make is that before he discards that name, he speaks glowingly of it. But in wanting to change it and thinking about what other names to make, suddenly he has an epiphanic moment, an experience, and he says, and wham, a name exploded in my brain. I mean, pay attention even to the way he speaks and how he says this thing. They're humorous. And you would think that the event he's describing is something pleasant, is something, that is worth associating with. No, we're dealing with, of course, a thoroughgoing killer, one that is immersed fully in the culture and language of violence here. And so it says, one, a name exploded in my brain, a strong, powerful name, a name that inspires the same gut-wrenching terror that a condemned man feels before the firing squad. A name that makes people tremble when they see it on a sign. From now on, I am Mad Dog. Now, at this point, when we encounter this individual, the transformation of himself from a human into, of course, a dehumanized being on account of war has happened. And here he says, the name I am taking is one that a condemned, criminal, that invokes the kind of gut-wrenching terror that a condemned man feels before his firing squad. And this is self-fulfilling because at the end of the day, Johnny Mad Dog dies. He has become so dehumanized on account of his bestial engagement in act of war that he becomes unfit to live in normal human society, and somebody has to take him out, and that's, what happens. So when he calls himself a mad dog, please take note of, that adjective. This is somebody that has become uncontrollable. This is somebody that is no longer governable. And this is somebody that has dispensed entirely with that precious part of us as human, the reasoning capability. And of course, they have to be taken out. So the name Johnny Mad Dog that he takes for himself is both expressive and motivational. It communicates what Johnny has become, the nature of his undertaking within the Mata Mata Ham group, rebel militia, and motivate him to conduct himself antisocially. That's what he does. So going by the names he chooses for himself as a child soldier, his worldview, his action, and the fact of his death at the end of the novel, Johnny Mad Dog comes clearly across as an irreparably damaged mind. He is represented as a dangerous figure, one whose representation fits the media portrait of African child soldier as people, as one of the newspaper reports classified them as people, quote, fluent in language of violence, but ignorant to the rudiment of living in a civil society, end of quote. At this point, because of time, I do need to transit to another character here. Here I go to Amadou Koroma's Allah is Not Obliged. Again, we see the character of this novel, Birahima, also engage in an act of self-introduction before he begins his account of witnessing. So, like Dongala's journey, Koroma's child narrator humorously introduces himself to the reader. I mean, after noting that what he seeks to tell is a bullshit story, one in which Allah is not obliged to be fair about all the things he does here on earth, he then proceeds, to introduce himself. Pay attention to his word. He says he wants to tell a bullshit story. In other words, in trivializing the story he wants to tell, or qualifying it as bullshit, he is trying, to invite interest, to help us understand what is this bullshit story about. In actual fact, if you read the entire story, you do know that this is not a bullshit story. This is a story that is at the heart of what, of course, makes the space in which he knows unlivable. This is a story of war, his own actions within it, and everything that it does therein. So to qualify it as bullshit, of course, is to be playing, to be economical in this case with the truth, to trivialize for the purpose of gaining attention. And that's what the humor here does, to help us appreciate the deeper importance of what the character is of course, saying. And so here is how Birahima introduces himself. He says, "My name is Birahima, and I am a little nigger." Hey, I'm a little nigger. Not because I am black and I'm a kid. I'm a little nigger because I can't talk French for shit. That's how things are. Birahima, a fearless and blameless boy. End of quote. Now, if you look at this passage, you find out that, there's a lot to, make one, a bit, there's a couple of laughable things, here. In characterizing himself as, a little nigger here, it tries to trivialize again the atrocity that he has been capable or that he has even, undertaken. And when he refers to himself as a fearless and blameless boy, we see two things that is at once true and untrue. As a fearless boy, for sure, if you read his story, you know the boy in this work is fearless, really, because of all of his, undertakings. But to qualify himself as blameless, is to never be able to speak the truth here. And this is not meaningless. Here is what the notion of blameless boy means. I mean, as a child soldier, if you look at the discourse of child soldiering, you find out that, especially from the Western lens, that kids who have been involved in armed groups in most African countries are often looked at as blameless, innocent victim. And what Birahima is doing here is to satirize, that qualification or that description of kids of his kind, who have been involved in war as blameless. Again, one thing that Birahima helps us to understand in this story and the way it tells us is to gain the sense that while it is true that some kids might start off in armed group as innocent beings, haven't been kidnapped or forcefully enrolled, they do not end up in that same manner. They become something else. And so when speaking about them, when trying to understand them, and when trying to make sense of their involvement in harm group, it is important to pay attention to their dual nature, to pay attention to their activities, because we don't want to say they are innocent victims and forget that they are also perpetrator, of crimes. So victim perpetrator is about a very good concept that is relevant for speaking about this kind of individual. And that's something that we gain in the way in which Birahima characterizes himself. Again, this individual proceeds to self-deprecatingly, of course, profile himself. And he has this to say. One thing you should note in the way he speaks, of himself is we're dealing with an individual whose childhood has become truncated. We're dealing with an individual who is a child without childhood. We're dealing with an individual who has, of course, forgotten what it means to be a child. And so in his description of himself, this becomes very clear. Here is what he says again about himself at some point. He qualifies himself, quote, as disrespectful. He qualifies himself as a rude goat, as rude as a goat beard, and I swear like a bastard. I don't swear like the civilized black nigger African natives in their nice suit. I don't say fuck, shit, bitch. I use Malinke swear words like faforo, which means your father's, of course, readers can see that on the on my screen. I say namkode, bastard, walai, I swear, in all of these ways. I don't give two fucks about village customs anymore because I have been in Liberia and killed a lot of guys with an AK-47, which we call Kalash, and got fucked up on Canif and lots of hard drugs. End of quote. Now, this is the individual that we're dealing with here. And when he says he doesn't use the word that Native Africans, use when they wear their nice suit, again, he's being satiric here, in that sense. And so in this humorous way of characterizing, of profiling himself, we see somebody who is pointing our attention to something more serious, to something more, damning here. And he goes on to say he is a proper street kid that sleeps with the goat and nicks stuff to eat from fields and concessions. And that's the guy we're dealing with here. And finally on him, I conclude here in saying that in seeking to tell a story to an audience, who critics such as Moynihan and Adesokan and Kondoriotis have separately argued involved human rights readers in the West, Birahima in this respect is not different from his contemporaries in the John, that is in the African child soldier John. He also mounts the rostrum to bear witness to the atrocities of war, but he differs from those peers, especially in Beast of No Nation and of course other stories of war, in the manner and tone in which he tells the story. I mean, he is more the humorous one, the more impish one than any of the characters in about how many of these kinds of novel in the African child soldier John. So unlike some of his peers, Birahima is not interested in being seen as a faultless victim of the adult world. His laughable description of himself as blameless notwithstanding, Birahima is one of the two child soldiers in the African child soldier John, genre, the other being Dongala's Johnny Maddox, whose characterizations are so repulsive that they repel readerly sympathy. Yet, as some scholars have argued, these characters seem to stand out as paradigmatic examples of successful child soldier representations because of the absence of claims to lost childhood or else effort made in their fictions towards recovering lost childhood. So, Chair, please, how many more minutes do I have? One or two?
It's time.
Oh, it's time. Okay, I am happy to wrap up. The third individual who I haven't got into in this three text is Agu in Beast of No Nation. In wrapping up, it makes sense to make the point that what I am speaking to with regard to how I am reading humor in this text is the point that the laughable way through which these individual characters tell their story, helps us to make deeper sense, of the kind of things they have been involved in. In other words, it helps us to make sense of the dehumanizing nature of war, particularly those involving children. It helps us to understand that even though they are biologically children by age, their actions, do not conform or do not show them, as people who lack agency or who do not know what they are doing. And so in that regard, humor here plays a significant role in helping to appreciate both the characters themselves as well as the event and issues and situations in which they are, of course, principal part of. So I'll leave it there. In my bigger project, what I am hoping to do is to go more in details in analyzing, the way in which humor, of course, helps us to make sense of the stories of war involving young people. I appreciate your attention. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation, Dr. Adeshola. So before we get into the questions, we're going to open up this session and make it a discussion. So if there are any comments from the audience, please share. If you have any comments and feedback on the paper, please share them. But I would like to just mention some of my, the key points that I got from your presentation. I think most important is, your emphasis on duality of these characters and how, it's important to understand them as victim perpetrators instead of just seeing them as children whose innocence and childhood has been robbed of them. That's important to see them occupying this dual space and the nuance in their characters. I think another important point is how humor is used to, convey this childhood innocence that has been robbed, and at the same time, also convey, the violence that comes with war. And I think one question that comes to mind is, why or how else can we read humor in this light? Especially when we look at how, in your descriptions of the characters and the children and how they express violence as something that is fun, and also express, their the kind of excitement that they get from it, as they engage in this act of violence. how is humor, what other role does humor play, in this? Is humor used to sort of tone down the effect of such violence, or what else do you think humor is doing in this works that you've shared with us? So before you respond to that, I would like our audience to share some feedback, comments that they may have, and if it's a question you have, please go ahead. We just want our presenter to take a breather before responding to questions for now. Any comments from the audience?
I have a question. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dr. Adeshola, for the thought-provoking presentation. Well, our scholarship overlap a little bit because I'm also a scholar of children and childhood. I also like that idea of, which in a different context, one of your scholarship, the panel you are convening at the next LSE, the question of representation without, representation of childhood, representation of children without childhood. So my first question is, what is the role of gender in this conversation about childhood memoirs and writings? Maybe I missed it. I didn't hear anything about gender or the gendering. Do girls who experience violence, do they write in a different way? What kind of violence did the children who experience similar situations, how did they represent themselves? Or what role does gender play in the representation of violence? Secondly, people say that time heals. That's what I hear. What happens when you write about your childhood as an adult? I wrote an article in one of the books I edited on childhood, where I was talking about memory of childhood. When you write about your experience as a child, as an adult, what implications do we get when people try to remember their childhood? How do we navigate the very thin and blurred line between fictionalization of experience and actuality? So these are the few questions. And thankfully for you, you are the only one out of the panelists that shows up. So the remaining panelists refuse to show up. And I promised myself not to let them present at NSC panelists again. Because they have the option of telling us ahead. They refuse to tell us ahead. And so they want to screw us up. So go ahead and take as much time as you like.
Well, please, can I get in? Oh, okay, that's LSA president. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Moderator, thank you very much for your question.
Before would you like to take more questions and respond at once, or would you like to respond to this one and then just...
I would respond to these two and then I will take others. I prefer that way. And again, I should note that I do not feel very happy that I'm the only one here. I came here for a conversation, really, so that to listen to other people. But let me quit crying over spilled milk and then address what questions there are. Mosumala, you were asking about whether there are other roles that humor play in this text, or that beyond serving as a downtoner, kind of like easing the heavy burden of tragedy that this text constitutes. Is there any other thing they do? On the surface, that's actually anyone who studies tragedy, can remember what is called comic relief, So this whole notion of easing the tension in audience of a tragic situation. This will seem the case if you're reading on the surface, okay? But when you look at it deeply, we are dealing, the fact of having those you consider as innocent, as children, being the drivers of war, it's itself a terrible situation. If you look at it, it's an alarming, disturbing thing. Now, how do you then tell such kinds of story, you know, in a way that we can appreciate the deeper meaning of, you know, what is at issue? I think what the authors are doing is to employ, you know, the instrument, you know, of, if you like, the device of humor to be able to do that. That when you have a situation that is so, I mean, I come from a place in Nigeria, in the Southwest, where they say something to the effect that when something becomes so terrible, you know, you can just engage it through the means of laughter. That's the best way to make sense of it and to say, to share it. And I think this is what is going on here. So that when you are reading these stories in the way in which these characters are talking, there are a lot of things I want to show about how these folks are saying what they are saying and what they are doing. But deeper, the deeper significance of the deployment of that technique, or I mean of that device, is to help us to gain a deeper understanding of what is going on. You know, we're talking about humor as a funny way of being serious, which is the argument that I am making, a funny way of engaging the serious, you know, the disturbing, you know, the reprehensible. And that's what is happening chiefly in this text. So that, again, in the essay, The Thin and Its Double, actually Mbembe makes the point that the best way to represent the, you know, roiling and horrible development within the political spaces in Africa, you know, is to do so through caricature, you know. And I do think that if you check newspapers, I mean, I was once a journalist, and I mean, once a journalist, always a journalist, I still, you know, I'm greedily following news in a global sense. You find out that cartoon helps to make this point. One thing, a newspaper story, what's a newspaper, a piece of, you know, story in the newspaper cannot communicate. You need a cartoon. You know, a cartoon does that effectively. You know, and that's, I see what is playing out in this text. So humor here serves to help us to engage the serious. It helps us to make sense of it. And indeed, as I have said, to repeat that point, it's a funny way of being serious. And that does not trivialize the issue at all. And neither does it, you know, make nonsense of it. In fact, it does the opposite. It's my argument. Well, I don't know. So to go to the second question, which I find very interesting from, you know, my president there, as I call him, the LSA president. Yes, you raised an important point about gender. Actually, I have coming out sometime next year an article, you know, a journal article on representations of, you know, girl soldiers. In fact, I read two texts as my, you know, center of interpretive engagement to make that point about the involvement of girl soldiers. As a matter of fact, my argument in that text is on the concept of child soldier. When you look at that concept, child soldier, in the way it has been used in the discourse of child soldiering, the impression that it creates largely is of boy soldier that tends not to be placed for girl soldier. In other words, what we see in the discourse about child soldier is what we have always seen about war, the masking, the erasing of women and trivializing, if they ever mention it at all, or banning of women's contribution to the process and the activities of war. The impression is that girls and women have no place in war, but historically that's not true. You know, if you look at all kinds of war, you see that women play fundamental, powerful role, you know, there. Even if it is war of independence, they were there, especially within the African context, they were there. If you go to Mozambique, if you go to Zimbabwe, if you go to all those places, they were there. Even in our own, you know, West Africa side of things, women play very critical role in war. And it's the same thing with the mobilization of children as war. I mean, as soldiers. Not only boys participate in these activities. Girls do all kinds of things. They are wives, you know, they are mothers. They go to the front. They cook. You know, they are the trophies for commanders who have won wars and all that. So when we then invoke the concept of child soldier, which is a problem with big international non-governmental organizations, the bingos. What they have done is that when they go to these places where war had happened and they need to demobilize and rehabilitate child soldiers, their attention has always been on boy soldiers in the unhelpful belief that they were the ones who were affected by war the most. And so most girls have been left unattended to. So I argue, in that paper, that what we are witnessing with the way in which the concept of child soldier has been deployed is to center the involvement of boys at the exclusion, of girls, and which is not helpful at all. And I will close my response to that question with this. Even if you look at Beast of No Nation, it's surprising. We can't legislate to a writer how they create their imaginary world or whatever, but it's surprising that Iweala got inspiration for this story from a girl soldier, China Kaitetsi, who was a girl soldier in the army of the current Ugandan president, Museveni, who had a rebel group at the time. China had traveled to Harvard, where Iweala was a student, under Jamaica Kincaid, doing his creative writing. And he was inspired, by the story of China Kaitetsi. However, when we look at Beast of No Nation, the army of commandant that we find in that story does not have one single girl soldier. Again, what you see clearly in this story is the absence, the erasure of girls. The only way, and I didn't get to that in my presentation, which I wanted to, which is also very humorous. The only way we find women and girls, and I say girl because there's only one girl, others are women. The only place we find them in this story is when Commandant takes his troop to his village. And when he gets there, we find out that these women and girls do not even know that war is going on. They are continuously in their trade of sex work. And that's the only use they find for them. And Commandant even says it there that if you are looking for sexy women, this and that, the way he describes it, as Agu says it here, you're going to find out that in the world of this story, women have no significance other than as pleasure machines. That's what you find, in this story. So that when we talk about African child soldier narratives, we see in these narratives the elongation, or if you like, the continuation of this whole business of raising women, especially women's contribution, to, of course, the business of war and society, as it were. And to the second question about memory, what role does memory play? I mean, somebody writing about, one of the things I find very useful and very interesting in my own research about children and warfare is this, especially the memoirs written by former child soldiers. I have read them as not any too significantly different from fictionalized account of child soldiering. Because what you find in those stories are deliberate distortions of fact for recovery or remembrance and all that. And here is the thing. Anytime we're dealing with memory is labile, is fickle, is not dependable. And each time we deal with any piece of writing, any act of work involving memory, that is the time we have to put up our thinking cap, because whoever is remembering, they remember for different reasons. And we don't remember accurately. We disremember. We remember in ways that we think serve our purpose at certain times. And I think, Professor Said will know this very well, I mean, as a historian, that, memory is something that requires critical attention to. Anytime anybody is invoking memory, we have to be alert mentally, because that is the stuff of real, critical questions, because of what you find there. And I close with this. One amongst many others, in fact, within the African child soldier genre, which is made up of fiction and memoirs, you find out that most of those who have written, former child soldiers who have written their memoirs, they have been seriously taken up because of the gaps that are manifest in their account. I mean, and that's not strange. It is the stuff of this kind of writing. But Some overdo it. For example, A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bear, one of the former child soldiers who wrote his memoir from, Sierra Leone. He was involved in the Sierra Leonean War, which was, for 11 years, as it were. When this individual wrote his memoir, we found out that the facts of his claim that he was even in an armed group and therefore fought was also shaky. People had come up with all kinds of things to raise that question about his involvement. And another thing, and I'll keep quiet here to take other questions. Another thing that is important in his rendition of his own experience as a former child soldier is that in the Sierra Leone Civil War, anyone who has read anything about that war would know that one of the defining traits of that war was rape. Rape features very, very, largely. All of the accounts by other people that I have read, of course, pay attention to this. For a person who said he was a soldier and fought in a particular army, rape is never in his story. He doesn't mention it. It doesn't come across. Even in the army, the notorious Fodesanko army, where we had this who was part of the war, he didn't mention it. Even in the Sierra Leonean army itself, he didn't mention it. And these things, rapes were rampant in those armies. So memory, when we deal, the place of memory is a very important point in account of this type, and it's difficult for anyone who is recalling their childhood to say they are recalling them in adulthood accurately. We must acknowledge that when we come across memoirs, when we come across biographies, when we come across autobiographies, we must not forget that in some way we're also before a fictional universe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeshola. So for the other questions from the audience, can we please get the other questions from the audience? Comments and feedback as well.
Good morning, Dr. Adeshola. Thank you for your presentation. So I'm just curious to know that, okay, do you think that these victim-perpetrator interconnections of these children experiences go beyond cause and effect categories and can also be seen as maybe metaphorical spaces of becoming, right? Because I'm actually thinking that beyond this victims perpetrator conversation, and how about is there a possibility that these are kinds of phases, right, or experiences that they go through within context of becoming in that sense? So I'm curious to know if it's you.
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. Please correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand you asking is about the concept of victim perpetrator, which is something that came up in my presentation. I hope I got you correctly.
And if it's possible for us to see it as spaces of becoming rather than a fixed victim perpetrator category.
Well, yeah, I get your point now. Thank you very much for the clarification. Well, if again I invoke something that I have always referenced, particularly in the course of this presentation, if you look at the discourse of African child soldier, a discourse that is heavily, constructed by different groups within, what you call the global north, or if you like, the West, you find out that the image of the child soldier that we find in the discourse is largely unhelpful, in that it does not account for how we can understand or make sense of the involvement of these children, within armed groups. For example, one of the things they emphasize the most, amongst others, is the nature of involvement within armed groups. They do look at these young people as people who were forced into war, largely. In other words, that it was through forceful recruitment that these folks made it there. And when they talk about war and children as if it's something that just began to happen with African wars. But that's not true. If you go back in time to the Crusades, the American Civil War, the First and Second World War, and all kinds of war, you would find that present on those battlefields were people whom today we now call children. You know, they played very critical role. In fact, I remember, you know, as one who has studied the American Civil War, you find out that young persons, because of their age, you know, wanted to be part of the war. And one of the things they did was to falsify their age, you know. And those who were allowing them in, who were keeping the gate, knew that falsification was happening here. But they, on the surface, want to stay with, oh yeah, this is the age of this fellow. I mean, no proof, nothing. And they admitted them. I have an article that I published in a journal 2 years ago, and this is in, you know, what was the name of the journal now? But basically, I mean, you can find it online. I am more interested in literary representations. So my work is not a kind of, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist or historian or any of those things, although I take, you know, I find those works done in those areas very useful, which again helps my, you know, helps the disciplinary, I mean, so multidisciplinary nature of my own engagement. But then if the article that I'm referencing, I read in a comparative sense, the image of African child soldier during the Holocaust. In other words, the Jewish child soldier and then an African child soldier. You find there is the difference between the profiling, or if you like, the representation is oceanic, very, very largely different, you know, in the sense. So that when you look at the Jewish child soldier is set up and framed as a patriot, is set up and framed as somebody who is, you know, a model of a good citizen, one who can lay down their life for the defense of their country, and one who can be involved in a war of purpose. In contrast, when you look at the image of the African child soldier, and this is funny, it's not foreigners who are writing these things, it's Africans themselves who are writing these things. You find out that the image of African child soldier is completely opposite to what I have just described with respect to the Jewish child soldier. So this is a criminal. The Johnny Mad Dog that I was, you know, giving you his profile a while ago from himself is peculiarly, you know, someone who is not fit to live in the way that he does his things. And so they are also involved in what is not a noble war. In fact, there is a scholar called Mary Caldo, amongst others, who have come up with this very funny, you know, distinction between two forms of war. For example, they talk about new war and old war. And we are to understand that particularly the First and Second World War are old war because those are wars aimed at a purpose, you know, liberty, freedom, democracy, and all that. But then wars such as happen within African context, we are to understand them as new war because they target civilians, as if civilians were not part of those who perished during the First and Second World War. And then they are purposeless wars. They are war with no purpose. If you look at Beast of No Nation, for example, the commandant that we find there is waging a war that we can't really put our finger to why he's waging that war. We don't understand. So basically, to not travel too far away from your question, is that when we then encounter children within the context of warfare, we must understand one thing. In the context of atrocities and precarious situations, children don't remain children. That's that fact. In the context of atrocities and precarious situations, children don't remain children. They act, they do something. And if we take that as a fact, that children don't remain children in those troubling conditions, when we then speak of the involvement of these folks, of these individuals in these situations, we cannot but understand that an appropriate way to make sense of their persons is as victim perpetrator. Because the truth of the matter is that some of them set out as victims, you know, people who were kidnapped. In the case of Agu that I study here, he is kidnapped, you know, and thrust into an armed group that he doesn't know anything about. But by the time he is being demobilized, he has engaged in such atrocious things that at the point that he is seeing an American, therapist, the American therapist in this story, Amy, keeps telling him, oh, it's not your fault. I mean, what I have called in my study explicatory, what is the concept here? Exculpatory sermonization, which is what Western therapists, do. Exculpatory sermonization, the idea that, oh, it's not your fault. We know you are part of the war, but somebody made you to go into it. To which Agu is telling Amy, look, stop talking to me as if I'm a child. I know what I have done. The child that you want me to be is gone. I am now a different person. War has effected a transformation, in me. So I cannot be looked at or spoken to as if I'm a child. I'm no longer that child. That child is gone, Innocence is gone. It's no longer recoverable. We must face that fact. I will keep quiet here on the notion of innocence gone.
Yeah.
Ishmael Beer, who I referred to a while ago, after his own demobilization, he got to the US, and one day he was asked to address a parliament of children in the United Nations. Just as he entered that hall and grabbed the microphone, he made this point. Don't be afraid of me. I'm no longer a child. I'm no longer a soldier. I am now a child. That's what those bingos, those non-governmental organizations involved with child soldiering want to happen. We know that that's no longer a child. As a matter of fact, if we think of innocence as, or lack of innocence as adult experience, exposure to adult world, the fact that Ishmael Beer had been part of an armed group, he has seen killing, he's participated in it, he's done all kinds of things, removes any legitimacy to his claim as a child after demobilization. Innocence is irrecoverable, in that sense. So it's important to keep that in mind and to understand that the best way to make sense of kids who have been part of, atrocity is to understand them as victim perpetrators, in this case, in most instances. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeshola. Do we still have any question from the person?
I have a question. This is an interesting work you are doing. Since your research interest is in the area of child soldiers or soldier, is there any theory, any framework undergirding this whole discourse? Because I have realized that in moments of war, children are always recruited. And I'm wondering what the motivations. If they are not the first to be recruited, somehow they are part of this whole enterprise. Is there any motivation? Is there any theory explaining why these commanders would target these children and then recruit them into the militia? Is there any motivation? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate your question. Of course. In my larger projects, in my larger project wherein I read child soldier, narratives, there were all kinds of, frameworks, or if you like, conceptual frameworks that I found, that I thought relevant, that I deployed, in my work, and, used to make the point that I was making for the, to clearly articulate and unpack my argument with respect to, what those texts are doing. But to your second question, which also is very, very important, yes, if you look at in the real life situation where children have been mobilized to be part of warfare, there are all kinds of reasons why children were part of warfare. And I'll take two examples. I'll take one, involving the Holocaust, and then another in African context. So during the Second World War, when Adolf Hitler, made it manifestly clear that they want to put an end to anything Jewish, we found out that young Jewish people, ended up in one group called the Partisans. There was a Jewish group called the Partisans. In fact, there's a movie for that. If you haven't seen that, the Partisans, that's their name. this was a group that constituted itself as a nemesis, to the Adolf Hitler, monstrous machine. And you found out that they had all kinds of units within that group. One of the things the partisans never wanted to do was to involve children in that war. So they created what they call a playground. So if you are young, by the way they determine your age, you go there. Anytime you came to that camp, you were able to find them, you go. Not having kids go to the war front became untenable, because most of those kids made the point, they made a case for themselves. They said, the existential crisis that the Jews face in Europe was not targeted towards adult Jews, that it was targeted towards anyone who identified as Jew, children or adult. Therefore, if that is the case, it does make sense to confront this monster as one group that is facing an existential threat. And that argument made sense. And on that basis, children began to be allowed, based on whatever age they, but they're in today's parlance, those are young kids. And also remember that the whole thing about childhood that we talk about is also a recent phenomenon. Society in the past, especially in the West, weren't invested in childhood. It wasn't a thing. Because as you do know, for as every human category, this is an invention. So childhood is also, something happened recently as a follower of news. I was listening to Benjamin Netanyahu, and it was fascinating to hear him make a distinction between Jewish childhood and Palestinian childhood. For example, in Israel, you are a child until you are 18, and he makes that point. But in Palestine, he said, once you are 15, you're no longer a child. So there you can begin to see, the fact of childhood as a construct in this case. The second example I want to give would involve Africa. And then you find out that in most wars on the continent that have involved children, say in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Congo, and other places, one of the reasons why those commanders, recruited children was, number one, it was cheap to do so. It was very cheap to do so. And two, they were also easily expendable, and you can always resource them, with, more and more children from elsewhere. And they are also impressionable in certain ways. They can, unlike adults in this sense, they can easily obey instructions. They can easily do what you want them to do. And again, I say that with carefulness, because oftentimes we find it easy to say, oh, in this kind of circumstance, children will do this. If you threaten them, they will do this. We always forget too that adults also obey bad instructions under duress. So which is to say, this is not only applicable to children. If you abduct adult and there is no balance of terror, in other words, the abductors have the supremacy of power in this case, adults that they have kidnapped will do exactly what they want them to do in that circumstance. So this is not exclusive, to children, but there are all kinds of reasons why children are involved. And the last point I want to make about that, as I have found out in what I have researching, is that any war, go and find out, historically, any war that significantly involves children, it's not a war that ends very quickly. And if we can say, it is the reason why, even if tomorrow there is a cessation of hostility between Palestine, I don't want to use Hamas, I'm not part of the global media that deceives themselves, between Palestine and Israel, you will find out that it's just a rest. All of the over 15,000 people whose families have died, or children who have survived some deaths from their family, they're not going to go under. They're not going to keep quiet. And in our own backyard in Nigeria, the civil war that we waged how many years ago we are still looming in the shadow of its threat, because all those young people who are now adults, who grew up, who saw those things, are still very much actively charged, thinking that they have to right an error or wrong that was done to them at that point, or to their parent. So it's very delicate and a very serious thing. War involving children can be horribly, horribly protracted across generations.
Thank you so much, sir, for that response. So briefly, we'll have the last question and, also get a brief response to that question, please. From Pelumi Folajimi, yes. Please ask your question.
Thank you.
Before Pelumi, there's
Okay.
some Sikiru Abiono who put something in the, I don't know, I can't see him on the call again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Oh, he's still there. He's still there.
Yeah,
but I don't see the question. I don't see the question.
No. This is the only person who has a question from
All
Zoom.
right. Yeah, Pelumi.
Yeah, thank you, Ademola. I can see that your interest is very similar to that of your Siamese twin brother. This idea of genocide, war, your twin brother.
Please be brief with your question.
My question is in 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, of course, people, scholars in this area of study will agree with almost everything you said, Ademola. My interest now, my curiosity now lies in your contention that memoirs as means of memory preservation is not significantly different from imaginative narrative.
Absolutely.
I want you to provide a little more information about that, because you cannot say that Things Fall Apart, for example, is at the same level with There Was a Country. And you can also find it very difficult to say that Soyinka's Ibadan and Soyinka's The Man Died, or Soyinka's You Must Set Forth at You Must Set Forth at Dawn, which are works of memoir, are at the same level with, for example, Chronicles of the what?
Of a Happy People.
Chronicles of a Happy People, or of the Most Happy People on Earth, or The Interpreters. We cannot bring them, to the same level. What the two of them are saying, or what the two categories of writing are saying, are largely different. Their orientations are different. Their aims and objectives, the goals are different. So for you to say they are not significantly different, I find it a little more demanding of further explanation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Pelumi, thank you. That's equally an engaging poster to put across in this kind of conversation. Well, if I just would take your Soyinka alone, and I would just take only one thing from the Soyinka you have referenced and then go on to answer your question more properly. If you look at You Must Set Forth at Dawn as a non-fictional work, a careful reading will present to us rather, the fictional qualities of those works. And here is one thing I took away from reading that book, which is what I said, that whenever we are before memoirs or any of works like that, we have to be very careful. When you look at how Soyinka characterizes particularly Babangida and his relationship with him, you would think that this is someone who is giving us an objective account of a Babangida and his relationship with Soyinka. You have to pay attention to what Soyinka is doing there, and which today, most people, if I say this in a bigger forum, I am sure the netizens of today will come for my head, because it is Soyinka. We always make that mistake. But what Soyinka does in that place is to fictionalize on a relationship that did not exist the way he characterized it. If anything, Soyinka's relationship, not just with IBB, but with other dictators, he comes to us only when those relationships go sour. Otherwise, those guys are in bed anytime, any day, together. In the case of IBB, if you go and check it very well, it's only when the the going goes bad, that he comes to us, as readers and talk to us about, oh, this is what happened and all that. But if you really understand what went on, you can understand that, look, you are fictionalizing here. This is not the relationship that happened. I mean, I will put it, at that, and go to the point that you're making. I wanted to ask you a question, Kwelumi. If you look at You Must Set Forth at Dawn, there was
I am here for your question.
Right, or Ibadan, whatever kinds of memoir. The question is there plots in that story? Are there characters there? Is there a setting there? Is there a point of view from which the story is told? Are there themes and whatnot? In case you didn't get it, I have just outlined properties of a fictional work. So all of these are in anything that you're referring to as nonfiction. The writer has to sit down to determine who they are bringing into that story and who they are not going to bring into that story. Not any unlike what a fictional writer does as a god who creates a universe. Okay, they have to determine what they remember or what they want this person to say and what they don't want them to say. In other words, at every turn, you are carefully constructing something. It is in that sense that I speak to the fact that the work that I read, the memoirs of African child soldier narratives, and they are fictions, I do not significantly see any difference, between them. In fact, if you want to go to their thematic trust, I did mention in my comparative examination of these 3 novels that I examined in this presentation, that the Africa that we encounter in this text is the same Africa. It's one homogeneous, unlivable, horrible, and of course, bound to violence of a place. If you look at the memoirs of child soldiers, that's exactly the Africa you find there. If you also look at what happened to, at the end of the war that each text deal with, the memoirs and the novels, you find that, except in the case of Johnny Mad Dog, all other fictional child soldier characters got saved by some foreigner. And today, as I speak with you, all those former child soldiers who have now written their memoirs have done so far away from Africa, anywhere in Africa. They are all somewhere in Europe or in North America. Not one of them is residing anywhere on the continent. Now, for me, that is significant, and that is the part of the argument I made in my work, that these works are telling us that while rehabilitation may begin in Africa, for it to be successful, it has to be completed elsewhere, because the Africa that we're looking at is unlivable. In other words, there is the possibility of being recycled into the cauldron of violence if these people stay back. And so the place where they can, begin a different journey when rehabilitation is activated in Africa is for them to go outside of it. And today, as I'm talking to you, check again, there are tons of them. Not one of them resides anywhere in Africa. They are all in the way. And all their memoirs were published in these places I'm talking about, whether in Europe or, in this thing. So there's a lot going on between these two things. And don't take my word for it alone. This scholar, Philippe Lejeune, if I get his name properly, who has written extensively about memoirs, autobiographies rather, I think it's a book to look at and see, the point that has been made about, that. And it's going off of that I am making this argument in my own work about nearly, if there are differences, they are of an insignificant kind, And finally, to wrap up, perhaps in the way I started, you see, when you go back to there was a country, Achebe is not writing for us a history of a place. He's giving us his own perspective of what it all happened. And in that perspective, there's a lot to question. There is a lot. The difference between them and fiction is that the fictional, the person writing fiction understands themselves as writing fiction, you know, and that's why Achebe in an essay, the truth of fiction makes a distinction between two kinds of fiction, which he calls malignant fiction and benevolent fiction. He argues that benevolent fiction knows itself as fiction, that it is a construct, that it is something made up. It doesn't claim any further. But with memoirs, even when the residue, or if you like, the element or the activating agent is your own story, we do know by the time you are done, when you get to the last page, we cannot totally, or if you like, we cannot magisterially or confidently claim that this is a work without fiction. So every writer who writes that kind of genre, or in that kind of genre, you know, does something. When I teach this at the undergraduate level, particularly first year, I am careful to always let them know. You know, just to wrap up, whenever students come into my class for the first day, and I ask them to sit in groups and talk about themselves, just say anything about yourself as a means of introducing yourself to, you know, whoever you are dealing with there. At the end of the day, I ask them, who has said anything negative about themselves? You will find nobody. What are you doing there? It's difficult for anyone to want to introduce themselves or talk about themselves to somebody and then, you know, go about some dirty things. We all make effort to curate our image. Even when we want to talk about something unpleasant we have done, once it goes into people, we are curating it in a sense that it can be acceptable and pleasant to the ears of anyone who is hearing. So we need to be suspicious, you know, of any non-fictional account, especially that calls itself autobiography, biography, and memoir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeshola, for your responses, and thank you all for your questions as well. Thank you once again for the wonderful presentation, and yeah, so that's all from here.
I want to thank you, moderator, for your patience and for your the gift of your time, and I want to thank the audience too for those questions and for your attention. I appreciate them. They help me to think more about what I am doing, and of course, pay attention further and further. And I thank the LSA, you know, for bringing this to happen. Thank you, everyone. Mosumala, please don't forget the stuff.
Yes, I'm
Thank you very much. Do have a pleasant weekend.
Indeed. Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Good to see you again.